The footprints in the snow should not have existed. That was the first thing that made Caleb Hartley's chest tighten as he trudged up the ridge toward his cabin, his boots sinking past the ankle with every step. The second thing was that the footprints led straight to his front door, which was standing open by an inch, letting a thin ribbon of warm firelight spill out into the storm. Before the story continues, if you believe kindness always finds its way back to the people who give it, take a second to like this video, subscribe to Winter Vale, and stay until the very end, because what happens in this cabin tonight is only the beginning of something much bigger. Nobody came this far into the Colorado backcountry during a blizzard. The road below Pine Hollow Ridge had been buried under 2 feet of snow since noon, and the trail winding up to Caleb's property had disappeared entirely once the wind picked up an hour earlier. Most people had the sense to stay away from a mountain in weather like this. Whoever had made those footprints clearly did not, or clearly had no other choice. Caleb was 34 years old, broad-shouldered from years of splitting wood and mending fences, with dark hair that always looked like it needed cutting and pale gray eyes that had gone quieter every year since he buried both of his parents. A drunk driver had taken them from him 3 winters earlier, on a stretch of highway not unlike the one currently disappearing beneath the storm outside. Since then, the mountains had become the only place that didn't ask him questions he couldn't answer. He had spent the morning 3 miles east, wading through drifts to herd a neighbor's spooked cattle back into a broken pen before the storm buried the fence line completely. And by the time he turned back toward home, the wind had already erased his outbound tracks entirely, leaving only a featureless white slope between him and the tree line where his cabin sat. He had told himself the whole walk back that the ache in his chest was only the cold. He pushed the door open slowly, his hand tightening around the axe handle he had grabbed from the porch rail out of pure instinct. The warmth from his fireplace, the one he had banked low before leaving that morning to check on a neighbor's stranded cattle, rolled over him in a wave that smelled like wood smoke and pine. And then he saw her. A young woman lay curled on his couch beneath the old quilt his mother had stitched years ago, snow still melting slowly in her dark auburn hair. Her lips carried a faint blue tint, and for one terrible second Caleb thought he was looking at a body rather than a person. He dropped the axe and crossed the room in 3 strides, kneeling beside her and pressing 2 fingers to her throat, and the relief that flooded through him when he felt a pulse nearly buckled his legs. She was breathing, but barely, each breath shallow and slow, the kind of breathing his father had once described from a winter search and rescue call gone almost wrong. Caleb built the fire higher, wrapped a second wool blanket around her, and checked her fingers and toes for frostbite the way his father had taught him years ago on this very hearth. There was a backpack on the floor beside the couch, half open, with a cracked phone screen and a folded photograph tucked inside, but nothing that explained who she was or how she had walked into his home. He remembered, without wanting to, the last time he had waited like this beside someone who might not wake up. His mother had lingered for 2 days in a hospital bed after the crash, machines breathing for her, while his father sat in the chair beside her holding a hand that never squeezed back. His father had followed 6 months later, less from any diagnosis the doctors could name than from a heart that had simply stopped finding reasons to keep going. Caleb pushed the memory down the way he always did, focusing instead on the stranger's shallow breathing in front of him. For nearly 3 hours, she didn't stir while the storm outside grew worse, rattling the window frames and burying the porch steps under fresh drifts. Caleb sat across from her in the old armchair his father used to read in every evening, watching the slow rise and fall of her chest, feeding the fire every 20 minutes, wondering what kind of desperation could push a person out into weather like this without a coat heavy enough to survive it. When she finally stirred, her eyelids fluttering and then snapping open, panic crossed her face before anything else registered. She sat up too fast, gasping, one hand flying to her chest as her eyes darted around the unfamiliar room. Caleb raised both hands slowly and stepped back toward the fireplace so he wouldn't frighten her further. "You're safe," he said, keeping his voice low and even. "You're inside. There's a fire going. Nobody here is going to hurt you." Her name was Ivy Sinclair, 27 years old, an elementary school art teacher from 2 towns over, with green eyes still glassy from the cold and a scatter of freckles across her nose that made her look younger than she was. She told him, In halting sentences between careful sips of the hot tea, he pressed into her shaking hands that her grandmother Margaret had collapsed 2 days earlier and been rushed to the small clinic down in Pine Hollow, and that Ivy had been driving through the storm to reach her when a fallen tree forced her car off the main road entirely. Her car had slid into a ditch several miles below the ridge, the front wheel wedged against a boulder hard enough that no amount of rocking could free it. With no signal on her phone and the temperature dropping fast enough that she could feel it in her chest, she had made a decision that could easily have killed her. She started walking uphill toward the only light she could see through the sideways snow, a thin gray thread of smoke rising from a chimney she prayed belonged to someone kind. I kept telling myself, just one more ridge, she admitted, her voice cracking on the last word. I don't even remember reaching your porch. Caleb listened without interrupting, something twisting uncomfortably behind his ribs the longer she spoke. He recognized that particular kind of stubbornness, the refusal to give up on someone you loved even when your own body was screaming at you to quit. He had felt it himself once, years earlier, driving through weather almost this bad toward a hospital that turned out to already be too late for the people he loved most. The storm trapped them together for the better part of 2 days. The main road stayed closed. Power lines came down across the lower valley, and the only sound outside the cabin was wind tearing through the pines like something alive. At first, their conversation stayed careful, two strangers circling each other politely in a small space. But isolation has a way of wearing down walls that would normally take weeks to fall. Over bowls of stew warmed slowly on the wood stove, Ivy told him about the 22-second graders in her classroom, about the mural of a mountain sunrise she was halfway through painting on the gymnasium wall, about the grandmother who had raised her after her parents divorced and drifted in opposite directions when she was 9 years old. Caleb found himself talking more in one evening than he had in the last 3 years combined. About the ranger job he had walked away from after the funeral, about the silence he had built his entire life around, because it hurt less than the noise of missing people who were never coming back. Can I ask you something? Ivy said on the first night, wrapped in blankets by the fire, her voice still hoarse from the cold. Why do you live all the way out here? Alone, I mean. Caleb was quiet for a moment, turning a log over with the poker before he answered. My parents built this place before I was born, he said finally. After they died, everything in town reminded me of them. Up here, the mountain doesn't remind me of anything. It just is what it is. Ivy studied him across the firelight and didn't push further, but something in her expression told him she understood exactly what he meant. Later that first night, unable to sleep despite her exhaustion, Ivy noticed a worn deck of cards sitting on the shelf beside a row of paperbacks and asked if he knew how to play anything besides solitaire. Caleb dug the deck out with a faint, surprised laugh and taught her a card game his father used to play with him on nights just like this one, keeping score on the back of an old grocery receipt while the wind screamed outside. Your dad sounds like he was a good teacher, Ivy said quietly, studying her cards. He was, Caleb answered, and for once the words didn't come with the usual weight attached to them. The next morning, while the storm still raged outside, Ivy insisted on helping despite Caleb's protests, wrapping herself in one of his old flannel shirts over her still damp clothes and stacking split wood by the door while he cleared snow from the small back porch. You don't have to do that, he told her, watching her stack logs with careful precision. I know, she said, not looking up, but I've never been very good at sitting still while someone else does all the work, especially when that someone just saved my life. On the second night, while the wind screamed against the shutters harder than it had all storm, Ivy stood by the frosted window with her arms wrapped tightly around herself, watching snow pile against the glass in slow, deliberate drifts. I'm scared, she said quietly, not turning around. Not of the storm anymore. Of losing her. She's the only family I have left, and I don't know what I'll do if I get there too late to say goodbye. Caleb crossed the room and stood beside her, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, the fire throwing long shadows across both their faces. I know that fear better than I'd like to, he said. I lived inside it for a long time after my parents passed. It doesn't ever fully leave, but it gets easier to carry when you're not carrying it completely alone. Ivy looked up at him then, and something quiet and unspoken passed between them, something neither of them was ready to name out loud just yet. Ivy told him, too, about the year she turned 9, when her parents sat her down at the kitchen table and explained in careful, rehearsed sentences that they would be living in different houses from now on, and how neither of them had ever quite found room for her afterward between new marriages and new children. Margaret had driven 3 hours that same week to bring her home for good, and had never once made her feel like an inconvenience in 20 years since. "She's the reason I believe people can choose to show up for you," Ivy said, staring into the fire, "even when they don't have to." They talked until nearly midnight that second night, about small things that somehow felt enormous in the firelight, favorite childhood memories, songs that made them cry for no reason, the strange comfort of falling asleep to the sound of snow against a window. When Ivy finally drifted off on the couch again, Caleb sat awake a while longer, watching the fire burn low, aware of something shifting inside his chest that he hadn't felt in 3 long winters. On the third morning, the wind finally died down and pale sunlight broke through the clouds, turning the snow-covered ridge into something almost blinding to look at. The plows had been working since dawn, and by midday word came crackling over Caleb's old radio that the road down to Pine Hollow was passable if drivers went slow and stayed patient. Ivy's relief was immediate and visible, and so was the strange heaviness that settled over both of them once they understood their time in the cabin was ending. Caleb insisted on driving her himself, since her own car was still buried nose first in a ditch 3 miles down the mountain. The trip took nearly an hour along roads slick with refreezing ice, past pines bent low under the weight of fresh snow, neither of them saying much because there was suddenly too much to say and not nearly enough time left to say it. When they pulled up outside the small clinic, Ivy's hands were shaking so badly she could barely work the door handle. She ran inside while Caleb waited in the idling truck, watching the minutes crawl by on the cracked dashboard clock, feeling an ache he didn't fully understand for a woman he had known for less than 3 days. When she finally came back outside, tears were streaming down her face, and for one horrible second Caleb feared the very worst. Then he saw the small, disbelieving smile underneath the tears, and his own chest loosened for the first time in what felt like hours. Margaret Sinclair was alive, weak, recovering slowly from what the doctors called a minor stroke, but alive, and lucid enough almost immediately to ask her granddaughter who the tall, quiet stranger waiting outside in the truck was. When Caleb finally stepped inside at Ivy's insistence, Margaret studied him for a long moment from her hospital bed with sharp, assessing eyes that reminded him instantly of Ivy's. "So you're the one who kept my girl from freezing to death on a mountain," she said, her voice thin but steady. "I owe you more than a thank you, young man." Caleb shifted uncomfortably under her gaze. "She's the one who survived a blizzard on foot to get to you, ma'am. I just kept the fire going." Margaret's eyes softened at that, and she reached for Ivy's hand on the blanket. "Sounds like you found a good one," she murmured, and Ivy's cheeks went pink in a way she couldn't blame entirely on the cold. Ivy hugged Caleb tightly before she went back inside to sit fully with her grandmother, an embrace that lasted only a few seconds but somehow carried everything neither of them had managed to say during 2 days trapped together by a storm. Caleb returned to his empty cabin that evening to a silence that felt different than it had for 3 years. Less permanent, less like a punishment, and more like a pause waiting to be filled. He sat by the fire long after dark, staring at the indentation Ivy's body had left on the couch cushions, at the empty mug still sitting on the side table, and found himself, for the first time since the funeral, dreading the ordinary quiet he had spent 3 years building his entire life around. He told himself it was foolish to miss someone he had known for barely 3 days, but he found himself checking his phone anyway that night, hoping for a message that eventually arrived a week later, short and simple, asking if he wanted to get coffee in town sometime. What began as an occasional visit slowly became something steadier over the following weeks. Ivy would drive up on weekends with groceries and paint supplies, and Caleb taught her to split wood properly instead of hacking at it sideways, standing behind her with his hands guiding hers on the axe handle until she finally landed a clean strike that sent the log flying apart in 2 even pieces. She whooped loud enough to startle a pair of jays out of the pines, spinning around to grin at him with such open, unguarded joy that Caleb forgot, for a moment, to remind himself not to get used to having someone around. Margaret recovered enough to move back into her small house on the edge of Pine Hollow, and Ivy split her time carefully between her grandmother, her classroom, and the ridge where a lonely rancher had somehow, quietly, become the center of her entire week. One Saturday afternoon, Ivy brought her students' finished mural photographs up to the cabin to show Caleb, spreading them across his kitchen table with obvious pride. The kids kept asking if the mountain man in my stories was real, she said, laughing at his raised eyebrow. I told them you were a myth. Like Bigfoot, but grumpier. Caleb huffed out something close to a real laugh, the sound unfamiliar even to his own ears, and Ivy paused mid-sentence just to watch him do it, like she was memorizing something rare. Margaret insisted on cooking dinner for both of them one Sunday, once she was steady enough on her feet again, waving off every offer of help from her small kitchen while Caleb and Ivy set the table under her direction. You split wood for a living and you can't set a table straight, Margaret teased, swatting Caleb's hand away from a crooked fork, and the sound of her laughter filling the small house made Ivy pause in the doorway just to watch, grateful in a way she hadn't let herself be in months. Over pot roast, Margaret told stories about Ivy as a stubborn, paint-stained child who once covered an entire fence in her favorite blue, and Caleb found himself laughing so hard he nearly choked, feeling, for the first time in years, like he belonged somewhere other than his own quiet cabin. One of her students, a shy 7-year-old named Toby who rarely spoke above a whisper, had drawn a crayon picture of a tall man standing beside a cabin with smoke curling from the chimney after Ivy mentioned, just once, that a kind stranger had helped her during the storm. He handed it to her without a word one morning and mumbled that he hoped the mountain man knew he was a hero. Ivy kept the drawing pinned above her desk for the rest of the year, and the first time Caleb saw it taped to her refrigerator months later, something in his chest tightened in a way he didn't try to explain. Some evenings, she worked quietly on the easel by the window while Caleb read nearby, adding another careful layer of gold light to the windows and the painting, another soft drift of snow along the roofline, never quite finishing it because some part of her wasn't ready to admit the story it told might actually have an ending worth painting yet. Caleb watched her work more than he watched the fire those nights, memorizing the small furrow of concentration between her eyebrows the way he'd once memorized the shape of the mountains outside his window, back when the mountains were the only thing he trusted to stay. It was during one of those visits, nearly a month after the storm, that Ivy first mentioned the letter. She pulled it out of her coat pocket at Caleb's kitchen table, her expression tight with worry, and slid it across to him without a word. It was from a company called Sterling Peak Resorts, addressed to Margaret Sinclair, offering to purchase her property along with several others in the valley for what the letter called fair market value, with a deadline circled in red less than 60 days away. Ivy's hands had trembled slightly when she first pulled the envelope from her coat pocket, and Caleb noticed the way she kept glancing toward the window, as though half expecting someone to be watching them even inside his own kitchen. She called me crying last night, Ivy admitted quietly before he had even finished reading. She kept saying she didn't want to be the reason we lost the house her husband built. I didn't know what to tell her. Caleb reached across the table and covered her hand with his own without quite thinking about it first. Caleb went very still reading it, because he had received an almost identical letter 3 weeks earlier, signed by the very same man. Grant Wilder, CEO of Sterling Peak Resorts, a broad-shouldered developer with silver hair and an expensive smile, who had spent the past year buying up land across Pine Hollow Ridge for a planned ski resort expansion, and who did not take kindly to landowners who told him no. He's been sending people around, Caleb admitted, keeping his voice level even as anger tightened behind his ribs. A few weeks back, someone slashed 2 of my truck tires overnight. No note, no explanation, just tires cut clean through in my own driveway. I reported it to the sheriff, but there wasn't much they could do without proof of who did it. Ivy's face had gone pale. He's been calling my grandmother twice a week, she said quietly, telling her the offer expires soon, telling her prices only go down from here. She's scared, Caleb. She thinks if she doesn't sign, something worse is going to happen to her. They spent that entire evening at Caleb's kitchen table going through every letter, every voicemail transcript Ivy had saved carefully on her phone, piecing together a pattern that stretched across at least a dozen small properties scattered along the ridge. Wilder wasn't simply making an aggressive business offer. He was systematically pressuring elderly homeowners and isolated landowners who had no easy way to fight back. using fear and exhaustion as leverage the same way the storm had once used the cold against Ivy. The following weeks brought a fragile kind of peace despite the pressure building underneath it. Caleb and Ivy grew closer with every visit, trading small kindnesses that meant more than either of them said out loud. A fixed hinge on Margaret's stubborn front door, a painting of the cabin Ivy left half-finished on an easel by Caleb's window because she kept finding excuses to come back and work on it. But underneath the warmth, both of them understood that Grant Wilder's deadline was still counting down somewhere in the distance, and men like him rarely accepted no for an answer twice. The second storm arrived almost exactly a month after the first one, rolling in off the peaks with none of the mercy the earlier blizzard had shown. Caleb had gone into town that morning to file a formal complaint against Sterling Peak Resorts with copies of every threatening letter he and 3 other landowners had quietly collected over the past several weeks. He was halfway home when his phone rang, and Ivy's voice on the other end was tight with fear he hadn't heard from her before. "There are trucks up at your place," she said, breathless. "I drove by to drop off supplies, and there are men with equipment near your fence line. I think they're trying to move the property markers before the snow gets too deep for anyone to argue about where the actual line is." Caleb's knuckles went white on the steering wheel as he pushed his truck faster than the icy road really allowed, snow already starting to fall in thick, heavy sheets that swallowed the mountains whole within minutes. Ivy had barely hung up the phone before she was already in her car, hands trembling on the wheel as she pushed through snow that was falling faster with every mile, replaying the sight of those trucks over and over, terrified she would arrive too late to stop whatever Wilder's men intended to do. The drive that normally took 20 minutes stretched into nearly 40 as her tires fought for grip on the climbing switchbacks. And more than once, she had to fight down the urge to simply floor the accelerator and take her chances with the ice. By the time he reached the ridge, 2 unmarked trucks were parked just inside his property line, and a heavy-set man in a Sterling Peak Resorts jacket was hammering a survey stake into the frozen ground a full 15 feet past the actual boundary. Caleb recognized him immediately as Dale Prescott, Wilder's site foreman, a man with a permanent sneer who had clearly been sent to intimidate rather than negotiate anything. "You're on my land," Caleb said, stepping out of his truck into snow that was already ankle-deep and falling faster by the minute. Dale barely looked up from his stake. "Mr. Wilder's lawyers say the boundary's under dispute," he said, not bothering to hide his smirk. "Figured we'd get a head start before the paperwork catches up. Storm's not going to wait around for your survey crew to show up." Behind him, 2 more men were already unloading heavy equipment near Caleb's fence line, close enough to the cabin that the implication was impossible to miss. "Get off my property, Dale," Caleb said, forcing his voice to stay level even as his pulse hammered. "You know exactly where that boundary sits. You surveyed it yourself 2 years ago before Wilder got involved." Dale straightened slowly, sizing him up with the lazy confidence of a man used to people backing down first. "Careful, Hartley," he said. "You start swinging that temper around, and it's your name on the police report, not ours. Mr. Wilder's got lawyers on retainer for exactly this kind of thing." Caleb felt something cold settle over him, the particular fury of watching someone use the law as a weapon against people who couldn't afford to fight back. The confrontation might have stayed just words if Dale hadn't shoved Caleb backward when he reached down to pull the stake from the frozen ground, sending him stumbling into a snowbank. What happened next was fast and ugly. A scuffle that ended with Caleb's knuckles split open across one hand, and Dale's nose bleeding steadily into the white ground beneath him, both men breathing hard while the storm thickened around them, and the other workers scrambled back toward their trucks rather than get involved in it. Ivy arrived minutes later, sliding her car to a stop at the edge of the property, and the sight of her running through the snow toward him, terrified and furious in equal measure, was the thing that finally made Caleb step back and let the trucks reverse down the ridge road without further trouble. "They could have really hurt you," she said, hands shaking as she checked the cut above his eyebrow with cold, careful fingers. "This isn't just about land anymore, Caleb. This is dangerous, and it's only going to get worse." That night, with the second storm raging harder than the first one ever had, Caleb finally opened the folder he had been quietly building for weeks, printouts of Wilder's letters, time-stamped photographs of the slashed tires, A recording Ivy had saved of Margaret's most recent threatening phone call, and now a photograph Ivy had taken on her phone of the illegally placed survey stakes before the trucks fled the property. Separately, each piece looked like nothing more than an inconvenience. Together, laid across the kitchen table, they looked exactly like a pattern a prosecutor could use. The storm kept them inside the cabin for a second time, but there was no gentle drifting toward each other this time. Only urgency and adrenaline and the shared, unspoken fear that Wilder wouldn't stop with property lines alone. Ivy sat curled on the same couch, where she had once nearly frozen to death, watching Caleb check the door locks twice and then a third time, and realized with a small jolt that she was no longer just worried about her grandmother's house. She was worried about him, about the two of them, about a future she hadn't let herself imagine out loud until a stranger's threats had suddenly made it feel fragile. Around midnight, headlights swept briefly across the frosted window, gone again before either of them could be certain they had really seen anything at all, and Caleb spent the rest of the night by the fire with his father's old shotgun within easy reach, not sleeping, watching the snow fall harder and harder against the glass. By morning, the storm had finally passed, leaving the ridge buried under nearly 3 feet of fresh powder, and the folder of evidence sat on the kitchen table between 2 cups of coffee neither of them had touched yet. "We take this to the sheriff and the county attorney," Ivy said finally, her voice steadier than Caleb expected it to be. "Not just for us. For every family on this ridge who's too scared or too tired to fight him alone the way we almost were." Sheriff Boone, a heavy-set man who had known Caleb's father for 30 years, sat across the kitchen table 2 mornings later and paged slowly through the folder without saying much until he reached the photograph of the misplaced survey stakes. "This is enough to open a real investigation," he said finally, tapping the page. "But I'll tell you now, Wilder's got money and lawyers, and this county's small. It won't be fast, and it won't be easy. You too sure you want to see this through?" Ivy answered before Caleb could. "He's been terrorizing an entire ridge full of people who trusted him," she said. "Somebody has to see it through." Boone studied them both for a moment, then nodded slowly and closed the folder. "Then let's get started." It took another 8 days for the case to truly move. 8 days of written statements and sworn affidavits from 3 other landowners who finally came forward once they learned they weren't the only ones being targeted, and one very uncomfortable meeting where Sheriff Boone laid the entire folder across Grant Wilder's own desk in front of his lawyers. Wilder's practiced, expensive smile finally cracked when the county attorney mentioned intimidation charges, criminal trespassing, and a documented pattern of harassment aimed disproportionately at elderly residents across the ridge. Grant Wilder tried, in that meeting, to talk his way out of it the same way he had talked a dozen elderly landowners into signing papers they didn't fully understand. "This is a misunderstanding between neighbors," he told the county attorney smoothly, folding his hands on the desk. "My company has done nothing but make generous offers to this community." The county attorney simply slid the folder of affidavits across the desk without a word, and for the first time in the entire ordeal, Caleb watched Wilder's confident expression falter as he read statement after statement bearing names he clearly recognized. Margaret Sinclair sat in the front row of the small county courthouse the day the settlement was announced, her hand wrapped tightly around Ivy's the entire time, watching as Sterling Peak Resorts formally agreed to drop every acquisition offer on the ridge, pay damages to the affected landowners, and submit to an independent audit of its land acquisition practices across the entire state. Dale Prescott was charged separately for the altercation on Caleb's property, and Grant Wilder's name quietly disappeared from local headlines within the month, replaced eventually by a brief company statement about restructuring under new leadership. In the months that followed, the 3 other landowners who had come forward began repairing fences and reopening trails that Sterling Peak Resorts had once threatened to bulldoze for a golf course nobody on the ridge had ever wanted. An elderly widower 2 properties over, who had nearly signed away his family's homestead out of sheer exhaustion, drove up personally to thank Caleb and Ivy with a jar of his late wife's blackberry preserves, telling them quietly that he hadn't slept through a full night in months until the settlement was announced. Word spread through Pine Hollow the way it always did in small towns, and for the first time in years, people on the ridge stopped locking their gates out of fear of strangers in company trucks. The victory should have felt like enough, and for a while, Sitting in that courtroom with Margaret's hand in hers, it genuinely did. Caleb's land was safe. Margaret's home was safe. And the small community that had spent months living in quiet, simmering fear finally let itself exhale for what felt like the first time in a year. But something else had shifted during those two storms and the long weeks stretched between them, something neither Caleb nor Ivy had said aloud yet. Even as they had fought side by side against a man with far more money and far less conscience than either of them. It was Ivy who finally brought it up, one evening in late spring when the last snow on the ridge had begun to melt and wildflowers were pushing up stubbornly through the remaining patches of frost near the porch steps. She sat beside Caleb on those steps, close enough that their shoulders touched the way they had that very first winter night by the frosted window, and admitted quietly that she had spent the entire ordeal terrified of two different kinds of loss: losing her grandmother and losing whatever this thing between them was before either of them found the courage to actually name it. For a moment, Caleb said nothing at all, staring out at the tree line where the last of the winter snow clung stubbornly to the shadows. And Ivy felt her stomach drop, certain she had said too much, certain she had mistaken 2 frightening months of survival and adrenaline for something that had never really been there at all. She almost took the words back, almost filled the silence with an apology, when she saw his jaw tighten the way it did whenever he was working up the courage to say something honest. Caleb, who had spent 3 long years convincing himself that silence was safer than caring about anyone ever again, sat with her words for a long moment before he finally answered. "I told myself the mountains were enough," he said quietly, watching the last of the snow drip slowly from the eaves. "That I didn't need anything else in my life. And then you walked out of a blizzard onto my couch and proved me completely wrong within about 6 hours." He reached for her hand, and this time neither of them pulled away, and neither of them needed a storm as an excuse anymore. On the morning of the wedding, snow fell lightly over the ridge in soft, unhurried flakes, nothing like the violent storm that had first brought them together, and Ivy stood at the cabin window in her dress, watching it settle over the same pines she had once stumbled past, half frozen and terrified. Margaret, sitting nearby in her wheelchair with a warm shawl around her shoulders, reached for her granddaughter's hand and told her that some storms take everything from you, and some storms, if you're very lucky, hand you back exactly what you didn't know you were missing. They married the following winter, on a clear, cold afternoon with fresh snow dusting the pines around the very same cabin where Ivy had once collapsed on the couch beneath an old quilt, more dead than alive. Margaret sat in the front row wrapped in warm blankets, healthier than she had been in years, watching her granddaughter marry the quiet stranger who had once found impossible footprints leading to his door in a blizzard and chosen kindness over fear without a second thought. Margaret sat in the front row wrapped in warm blankets, healthier than she had been in years, watching her granddaughter marry the quiet stranger who had once found impossible footprints leading to his door in a blizzard and chosen kindness over fear without a second thought. When it came time for her toast at the small reception held inside the very cabin where it all began, Margaret raised her glass with a steady hand and said that she had spent years worrying who would take care of Ivy once she was gone, and that watching her granddaughter walk out of a snowstorm and straight into the arms of a good man had finally let her stop worrying altogether. Caleb, standing at the head of the room with Ivy's hand in his, found he couldn't speak past the lump in his throat and didn't try to. Toby, now a full year older and considerably less shy, insisted on showing Caleb his newest crayon drawing at the wedding reception, a mountain cabin surrounded by tiny stick figure guests, with the mountain man and the art teacher standing at the center, holding hands beneath a crooked crayon sun. Caleb crouched down to study it with the same seriousness he'd give any real painting, told the boy it was the finest artwork he'd ever owned, and meant every word of it. Ivy finally finished the painting she had started that first spring, the cabin buried under snow, smoke curling gently from the chimney, golden lights spilling out across the drifts from every window, and a small figure approaching slowly through the storm toward a door that was already standing open. She titled it simply, "The Night Kindness Found Me," and hung it above the fireplace where it still hangs today, a quiet reminder that the coldest, loneliest nights sometimes lead people exactly where they were always meant to end up. If this story moved you, if you believe one open door on one terrible night can change 2 lives forever, Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from tonight, and make sure you're subscribed to Winter Veil, because the next story is already on its way, and it might just restore your faith in second chances all over again.